Hi, good morning. I think we're going to make a start now. I think we've got everybody here that needs to be here. So officially, hello and welcome to our workshop on translational palaeoecology and the art of collaborative research. I'm going to kick some things off with some quick introductions. So my name is Jessica Gauld. I am a final year PhD at the University of Manchester. And my research primarily focuses on the palaeoecology of UK peatlands and how palaeoecology can be done in a collaborative way to make it more useful and impactful on peatland restoration practice. So although I spend most of my day looking down a microscope, I am really interested in how the links between research and practice and policy can be strengthened. So if you want to have a chat about that after the workshop, please come and find me. I'm joined here today by my colleague Morag, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Morning everyone. So I'm Morag Angus. I work on the West Peatland Partnership, so down in the southwest of England. We have big restoration project happening down there, but my sort of involvement today is really about bringing in the sort of practical side of things, why we are using palaeoenvironmental information to help inform our restoration and what we do, and just give a little bit of overview of what we're doing and how we've been involved in it. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so great, that works. The primary takeaway of this workshop today is to develop an understanding of how the knowledge gained through palaeoecological research can be practically useful in peatland restoration. And within that, we have three objectives. So the first is to introduce palaeoecology and some of the materials used within palaeoecology. For those of you who filled in the poll at the beginning, it seems like we've got a real mix of knowledge in the room, which is great. The second is to then explore the ways that palaeoecology can be practically useful in peatland restoration. And to do this, you'll be working in your groups through a series of tasks which are based on real-world scenarios designed to showcase how palaeoecology has been applied in peatland restoration. And for the third objective, I'd like to start to consider why it is the act of collaboration between practitioners and researchers that really transforms scientific research from interesting to actionable. Before we get into that, what is palaeoecology? So to put it simply, palaeoecology is the ecology of the past. Like ecology, it is concerned with ecosystems and the interactions of organisms within those ecosystems and with the wider environment. However, palaeoecology is concerned with much longer timescales, ranging from a few decades or centuries to hundreds of thousands of years or potentially even longer. So with palaeoecology, we can reconstruct past environments, see how they changed and developed over time, and make inferences as to why those changes happened, such as due to past climate events or human-driven pressures. And as we can't travel back in time to make observations as an ecologist would, palaeoecologists use organic and inorganic material preserved in sediments such as peat to make inferences and use them as evidence and proxies for past changes. So I'd like you to consider this timeline on the board here, which compares the potential reach of a palaeoecological record with a historic monitoring record. After the last ice age, we entered the Holocene epoch around 11,000 years ago, and this is where we saw a major expansion of peatlands within the UK. You can see that with a palaeoecological record, we can gather evidence and investigate how our peatlands have grown, developed, and changed through several different climatic periods and ages of human existence during this time. And although historic monitoring records can be wonderfully informative, they are often incomplete or simply don't give us the reach to understand processes that operate on much longer timescales, such as pre-disturbance characteristics, response and recovery to disturbances such as climate or fire, or the onset of invasive species, to give just a few examples. So, where do we find all of this wonderful information? Well, typically it will start with a peat core, like this one. So this is a section of a 4-metre peat core that I recovered as part of my PhD from a site called Holcroft Moss. It's around Greater Manchester near the Chat Moss complex, if any of you are familiar with that. And the depth of this section is about 2.2 to 2.7 metres below the peat surface. Radiocarbon dating tells us that this section is around 2,000 to 2,500 years old. And now not all cores are as well preserved as this one, but I wanted to show you this section as it has a really nicely preserved sphagnum section, which looks something like this under a stereo microscope. And you can see that despite being a few thousand years old, this is identifiable sphagnum. We can see what our sphagnum communities were like, over 2,000 years ago. So once we have our core, we might slice it up into 1 centimeter slices like this. And from these sections, we can extract whatever material and information we might be interested in. And just to give you a flavor of what that might include, we might want to look at plant macrofossils. So these are larger fragments of preserved vegetation. Can look at past vegetation over time. That might include things like seeds, stems, buds, twigs, and piece of woody material. We might also want to look at burning through charcoal. So this might range from unidentifiable micro charcoal pieces to these larger macro charcoal pieces, such as this charred leaf. We might want to move away from vegetation and look at testate amoeba. These are unicellular organisms. They respond to environmental conditions. They're quite sensitive. And we primarily use them to tell us about bog hydrology. We can reconstruct past water table positions through time, understand how our peatland has responded in a hydrological sense to past events. We might also look at elemental composition. So this was from X-ray fluorescence. We scanned the core and looked at iron and copper and lead. And you can see a spike in the shallower depths of the core there. So that might be an indicator of the onset of human disturbance and pollution in our landscapes. And finally, we might also look at pollen grains. So perhaps the most widely known palaeoecological proxy, another vegetation indicator. So this is just showing a sphagnum spore and a Calluna pollen. So like I said, this is just a flavor of what we can do with palaeoecology, but hopefully you can see from this slide the range of information about the past that can be extracted from our peat cores through palaeoecology. So, in the context of practical conservation, this understanding of the past has a variety of uses, and this can range from giving us pre-disturbance baseline conditions of what our site looked like naturally, however you would like to define natural and how far from natural it may have come. It might also give us some supporting evidence as to why we might want to reintroduce certain species onto our sites. Or it could give us some contextual information about why our sites look and behave the way they do now and how they have responded or might respond to future pressures. However, there are a number of barriers that can prevent academic research from impacting practice. So, for example, palaeoecology has been described as quite descriptive and technical. And if you combine this with a tendency to publish in academic research, which is often behind paywalls, this can mean that the relevant message for practitioners is lost. In addition, without practitioner input, the research priorities will not always align with the restoration priorities. And this is important because it means that the research is not as practically useful as it can be and is likely not to be acted upon in practice. So as part of my PhD, I've been looking at how collaborative ways to research can help to mitigate some of these barriers. And this is where the idea of a translational palaeoecology comes into play. So translational palaeoecology aims to support better integration of palaeoecology into practical restoration by exploring ways that practitioners and palaeoecologists can work together as co-researchers. So not to get too technical, but the three guiding principles of collaborative research tell us that the research does need to be scientifically sound. However, it also needs to be context-based and trustworthy in the eyes of the research user in order to have impact on practice. So what this essentially means is that the research needs to account for the factors that govern what action can actually take place. And this can range from policy directives, funding, time, available resources, the capacity of those who are applying the research, or the different stakeholders that might be affected by research decisions. Essentially, the research needs to be practically feasible as well as relevant. And I'm just going to finish with an insight into some of the work I've produced as part of my research. So earlier this year, I ran a workshop with 30 participants that included palaeoenvironmental researchers and restoration practitioners, such as Morag and a team. And what we were trying to do was explore how we could create an almost how-to guide to collaborative research for palaeoecology. And we came up with this five-step framework. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into each stage in detail. Happy to talk about that later if anyone's interested. However, the reason really for doing this and what we try to show is that having a process of collaboration in place can be important that those involved in the research have the space and the tools to operate across this research practice boundary, which is not always easy to do, which can be critical for actually impacting practice. A process like this can also change the dynamics of the research, moving away from a linear model of knowledge transfer from the academic to the practitioner towards a more pluralistic process. And this can ensure that the experiential and the contextual knowledge of the practitioner is brought in at those critical early stages to guide relevance and feasibility. This also promotes deeper understanding and trust and feeling of joint ownership over the research, which increases the likelihood that practitioners can actually act on the research. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Morag to talk through some of the case studies that inform the work that we will be doing in the workshop today.
I'm definitely not a researcher. I'm a practitioner. So, our project's been involved in paleo work since around 2005. We've been doing bits and pieces and working with various universities and contractors to try and gather some of the evidence for us, really. And it has really stemmed from the historic environment colleagues within our sort of project. Rose, who made the unfortunate mistake of leaving our project, has been involved and sort of guided some of the paleo work that we've done as well. So, it's really that angle that has sort of, I come from an ecological background, but bringing in that historic environment and has enabled us to just start sort of understanding our landscape a lot more. I can look at plants and say that's that, but actually bringing in the paleo work is really enabling us as the restoration practitioners and our project to have a much more holistic approach to our restoration, to really think about the habitats that are there, to think about the landscape that's there, why it's there, and what's influenced it in the past, but then also to think about and help those discussions, like we're all in this moment of climate emergency, nature recovery, landscape schemes in England, and what does that mean? What do we want those landscapes to be? How do we want our restoration to be, our peatland restoration to be, that catchment management to be? What sort of habitat species do we want in there? And the palaeoenvironmental sort of research that we've been doing has just enabling us to sort of understand some of those landscapes. So we can see that in certain areas there used to be trees in the landscape. From looking at charcoal, we've been able to understand a little bit about our heather moorlands, and particularly in the southwest we have an issue of Molinia. Our peatlands are dominated by Molinia, purple moorgrass. So it's kind of just giving us that insight and evidence to say, okay, there's a reason why this habitat is like that. I know there are lots of other issues, land management issues are happening, but it's really giving us that insight into it. And then, ultimately, it's sort of informing our restoration sort of methods and techniques that we are using on the ground. So this little case study here is just one little piece of work that we've done. This is on a site on Exmoor, and we've been looking at it for a couple of years in terms of thinking about what peatland restoration did we want to do there. But it's a fairly small area. It's around about sort of 60, 70 hectares, and it's got a tiny little bit of what's classified as blanket bog. I'm not sure it really is, but anyway, that's how it's classified. And then it goes into this lovely valley, Coombe, and it's got a straightened river that runs through it. And when we were looking at it, we were like, well, what do we want to do here? What do we know about this landscape? And so we kind of were, when we started it, we did all our initial, okay, we'll do wooden blocks and peat blocks, and we'll do that. And then we started sort of thinking about it a little bit more, came up with a plan, and we started our work. We got contractors on site, and when they were working, digging down, doing the restoration, they came across a lot of macrofossils, so tree stumps. And I think depending on what site visit you were out yesterday, you might have seen bogwood, I think gets called up here. So and it just made us stop and think and about what that sort of landscape could be. And so we sort of stopped work for a bit, and we got a consultant in Wessex Archaeology to come and take some cores and try and identify what the sort of timber was, what species of timber it was, and try and age it for us to try and understand the history of that site. And it identified a whole suite of information for us, species of trees that were there, and it was incredibly useful for us in terms of thinking about what the restoration we could do there. So when we were looking to do work on the Valley Mire, so into the channel, we started thinking about not just using timber materials. We started saying, okay, well, we know that there was willow and alder into this landscape at one point. So let's try and, I'm not trying to recreate a historical landscape, I'm just trying to make a resilient landscape. So we started to then plant willow behind our wooden blocks, our dams that had gone in, and we planted woodland on the side of the slopes. And having the evidence enabled us, because when we were talking to our regulators, so Natural England, the Forestry Commission, the Environment Agency, technically this site is mapped as deep peat, so, and anything over 40 centimetres, not meant to plant trees on. But when we got all our regulators out on site and we could say, look, you know, here's the evidence from the paleoenvironmental work that we've got. You can see that there's tree stumps in the base of the stream here, and we could explain what we were doing. It enabled us to have a really sort of good conversation and everyone to go, okay, this makes sense, and they allowed us to continue and do the tree planting. And it means that we're just bringing a more sort of holistic, resilient, better sort of piece of work together. And it also enabled us to have the evidence. We have a lot of, I'm trying to think about a diplomatic way of putting this, people who are concerned about trees being in the landscape in the southwest. Everyone likes these big open vistas, and you can say, well, yeah, that's nice, but actually, again, we've got this climate emergency, we've got this biodiversity emergency, and here we have the evidence to say, at some point in history, there were trees in this landscape. So, do you know what? It's okay to try and have them here, and we can start them in these areas and see what happens. So it's really enabling us, project, the conference here is about community engagement and everything. So it gave us that evidence to talk to stakeholders about putting woodland back into the trees and how we're doing our restoration, making big dams and putting sort of willow into that landscape and alder and silver birch and everything like that. So it's been a really, really useful bit of work for us to have. And also in terms of engaging with school groups and communities, it's just, they're fascinated by this stuff, and it brings a landscape alive to them rather than, just always talking about what you can see on the ground there. So, so it's really enabling us to do the restoration that we want to do, have those really difficult dialogues with some of our stakeholders who are fairly cautious, that's a good word, cautious about, trees in the landscape and allowing nature to develop. So, it's been incredibly useful for us. And we've done, lots of other bits of work around looking at charcoal to understand the level of burning on the moorlands, to understand how much heather's there and how much Molinia is there, and looking at, testate amoeba and that to try and use that as another way of thinking about water level. And, so it's just been really, really sort of eye-opening for us as a project and helping us to inform sort of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So, I think that's me.
Great, thank you. Sure. All right, so.
One last thing I wanted to say. So, I've been we're chatting away, but actually what I'm really interested as well is understanding what everyone else is doing in terms of the paleoenvironmental world, helping you understand your projects. And also one of the things I'm really interested in is what the strategy is nationally within each of the countries, and what resources are going into, or what funding is required for any paleoenvironmental work. And it is the direction of travel, like if you're in England, in terms of funding requirements, there's going to be more and more requirements around paleoenvironmental work. So I'm just really intrigued to know what others are doing and what level of funding you're putting into it and what resources are going into it. So, so as the tasks develop, it'd be great if you can scribble some of that on some of the sheets of paper. So
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. From a paleo perspective, I'd be really interested to see what people are doing in the room, and if anybody is really working with it and not just seeing it as a thing, another tick box that you need to do. Yeah, so please do include that if you are including that kind of work or thinking about it. Anyway, that is enough from us. It is now over to you. So for the rest of the workshop, we have 4 tasks that we would like you to work through. The first is going to be just about really familiarising ourselves with some of the materials that were introduced in the talk. For this, I've got loads of information sheets on the tables that you probably had a look at. And then the following 3 will be related to the case study work that was introduced as well, and really digging down into specific proxies and how they can help us in our restoration work. For each of these, we have sort of some reflective questions to guide your discussions. You don't need to stick to them. They're just meant to be sort of getting that thought process going. Okay. Also have some large pieces of paper we will pass around, so you can use post-it notes, you can scribble, you can have those discussions. Please just make a record of whatever discussion that you have. That'd be really, really interesting to see. We're going to do 20 minutes for about each task. We will also include a short break in about half an hour or so you can stretch your legs. And with that, we will set you off on the first task. Thank you. Yeah. We'll get some paper. If I can just have attention. Sorry to interrupt your wonderful conversations. I won't keep you too long, but in the sake of time, I'm going to move us on to the next task. So this is just really digging into some of the specific proxies that you've been discussing that are on your tables, and really starting to think about how they can be applied in a practical setting. So obviously on the same theme. So this first one is about understanding the vegetation. So you might want to look at your pollen and your macrofossil worksheet information sheets. And again, just some, and your charcoal as well. So if you just want to look at the reflective questions, again, we're thinking about what does charcoal tell us about the plants? How does the burning history might relate to the plants that we see today? How can we use paleo proxies to contextualize the current ecological status, thinking about maybe how they show us disturbance in the past and human intervention or climate in the past? And how could we maybe transform that knowledge into how we approach our restoration? Maybe, like our vegetation targets or how we re-wet the site, things like this. So again, about 20 minutes. We'll be wandering around if you have any questions, but again, over to you. Thank you. Okay. So I think we will crack on with the next task. So very similar theme. So we're moving on to Valley Mire restoration. Again, we're just reinforcing, how things like, our plant macrofossils could maybe tell us about local vegetation and incorporating that into our restoration and management plans. Okay, so yes, like I said, same format as before. We have our reflective questions. Please carry on these wonderful discussions that you're having, and remember to record everything that you are talking about. Thank you.